The headline today, 10th of December, is this. The world hits a heroic achievement of 1 terawatt of operating utility scale solar capacity. Utility scale solar in operation has doubled every 3 years since 2016. So this is a huge, huge, great story, remembering the fact that we have to get everything done a heck of a lot faster.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmens. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. And today we'll be talking about what perhaps is the most important technology, but it's much more than a technology that the world absolutely has to adopt as quickly and as comprehensively as possible, and that's solar power. We have our usual panelists, our regulars, Peter Carter from British Columbia and Paul Beckwith from Ottawa, Canada. We look forward to a stimulating conversation on what role can solar play, what role is it playing, and what can we do, what can we suggest to accelerate the adoption of solar power, which is essential to achieve the primary mission, which is to eliminate the use of combustion and fossil fuels so that we can begin to stabilize the global climate there. So today, that's what we'll be talking about. And we hope to, as 2026 continues, to do additional programs that focus on other aspects of decarbonization, wind power and nuclear and so forth. So we begin to look at what's the portfolio of actions that the world must take and is taking. And as always, we will give you some of the headlines that have been making the news in the climate world after we finish our conversation today. So please remember to stay for the entire program. So with that, we think we all know that we're in a planetary emergency. We need to stay as close to 1.5 as possible. And solar power, if we were talking 20 years ago, we'd be scratching our heads because it was barely known. It was extraordinarily expensive, unaffordable for most people, most companies. The technology was relatively primitive, but basically the cost of solar power has gone down by over 99% in the last couple of decades. There are millions and millions of solar panels being manufactured and installed every year, or every day, I should say, mostly from China, but also all over the world. And this is truly a revolution. The cost has gotten down to the point where it's maybe 10 cents a watt, 20 cents a watt, as opposed to $5 a watt or $10 a watt that it might have been a decade or two ago. So we've had remarkable progress, but we have an enormously long way to go. And that's, again, what we'll be talking about. So with that, I want to introduce again Peter Carter. Welcome, Peter, to the program. Peter, you're the founder and executive director of the Climate Emergency Institute. You've been an IPCC expert reviewer. And let's hear your perspective on where we are with solar power and what are some of the new developments that our viewers need to know.
Thanks, Herb. And thanks so much, Herb, mentioning that, yeah, this is all great and it's very encouraging, but yes, we got a hell of a way to go because that's very important. The headline today, 10th of December, is this. The world hits a heroic achievement of 1 terawatt of operating utility scale solar capacity. Now, me in my ignorance, I don't think I was even aware today that there was such a thing as utility scale solar. So this is absolutely phenomenal. I am shocked in the best kind of way. Utility scale plants were responsible for 50% of global solar PV. So that's also a huge, great shock and surprise to me. Utility scale solar in operation has doubled every 3 years since 2016. So this is a huge, huge, great story, remembering the fact that we have to get everything done a heck of a lot faster. I have another mention, which I think is huge, which was in the media April of this year. the first white solar panel ever seen in history. Now, I remember some years ago, the Swiss had invented a white solar panel because, of course, the black ones absorb heat. So this switches absorbing heat to reflecting heat energy. And the report I read says that they're more efficient even than the usual black solar panels. They're being used in architecture, so they're much more. If they get big commercial backup, financial backup, I mean, this will just take off.
Thanks, Peter. It strikes me listening to that, though I suspect the amount of reflection would be relatively modest on a global scale, but maybe this is a way to reconcile mitigation and emission reductions with solar radiation management if our solar panels themselves are reflecting some of the heat away. So I think it's really intriguing, and I look forward to us exploring this more in a future conversation that we have. And with that, happy as always to introduce Paul Beckwith. Paul is a climate system scientist who lives in Ottawa, has taught at universities in the Ottawa area, and has a very prolific and popular YouTube channel that focuses on every aspect of the climate emergency. And one thing I know we can count on you, Paul, is to give us a different perspective probably than others might give us on solar. So let's hear your perspective on this critically important technology.
Thank you, Herb, and thank you, Peter. I want to talk a little bit about the science behind solar energy, solar power. So, there's a lot of solid state physics involved in it. And Einstein, of course, was at the root of the discovery of the photoelectric effect around the turn of the previous century, so about 120 years ago or so. And he eventually, I think he got a Nobel Prize for that discovery. So the whole idea is that light can be treated as particles or waves, right? There's a duality in the theory. Sometimes light, from a standpoint, behaves as just a wave, right? And other times it's like a photon, a particle, a quantized amount of energy. And those photons basically hit a material and they can create electrons and holes, which are the equivalent of electrons but positively charged, and you can get a separation in the material. And then that creates a voltage difference from two different regions in the material, so you get a current flowing. When it was first discovered, the efficiency was really, really low because it was very difficult to make pure materials. So, one of the biggest improvements in material science over the years is to greatly increase the purity of the wafers and use cheaper materials. Different types of PN junctions were formed, and basically it became cheaper and cheaper to produce to get a given amount of power. As Herb said, cost has dropped over 99% over the past several decades. Of course, the potential of the sun is just enormous. And it's basically unlimited power as long as you have materials and you can make the things, which is why the rare metals and rare earths and silver is a great conductor. Different types of metals are sought out around the world as production greatly increases. So the amount of sunlight that hits the earth on average in 1.5 hours, if it was all captured, it would power the entire world for a full year. Okay, so what we're trying to do is capture a tiny, tiny fraction of the incoming energy. If we do it right, we can power our entire world. And this is very worrying to fossil fuel companies because it destroys their profit model. In Canada, I have to laugh or cry. Alberta has this bitumen, which is basically like asphalt, it's tar. And they add volatile substances, liquids to basically dissolve the bitumen, and it's called dilbit. And then they try to force it through a pipeline. They have to heat the whole pipeline. It's going to be archaic. I mean, we could be going all out in solar and wind and all these other renewables in Canada. But anyway, that's a whole other story. So these photovoltaic panels, the black panels that Peter's talking about, they're basically about 30% efficient now. They work best when they're cold If you heat them up, you actually get slightly more current flowing in the solar panel, but the voltage drops significantly. So the power is the voltage times the current. It's the current I times the voltage V. So they like to be cool, which is great in Canada, Canadian winters, because the efficiency is really, really high. They also use anti-reflection coatings so that they reflect less and less sunlight coming in and absorb more and more. And it's a very wavelength selective process. So there's certain wavelengths of the sunlight that generate a lot more power than other wavelengths. There's a whole spectrum. So it's actually quite interesting. And I just want to reiterate what Peter was saying in the recent news, because for the first 6 months of 2025, China actually installed 210 gigawatts of solar power. The US total capacity of installed solar power ever is 178 gigawatts. So China just installed way more solar power than the US has in their whole history. As Peter said, we passed the 1 terawatt. In fact, we reached 1,100 gigawatts, which is 1.1 terawatt. And China is planning for the foreseeable future to install probably on the order of a quarter to a third of that total capacity, doing that every year moving forward. I just want to say the reason they can do this is because they value science and technology and engineering and math. They value the STEM subjects. The typical Chinese policymaker or politician is an engineer or scientist. In Canada and the US, the typical policy and politician is a lawyer. Okay, so there's the difference. We can do things in a smart way or we can do things in a dumb way. And it's so impressive. When we're talking about solar power installations in the world, we're really talking about what China's doing. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation.
Thanks, Paul. I think we shouldn't forget, from what I understand, that another strong motivating factor for China is the concern about the population being a bit restive when they've had to deal with all the pollution from coal-powered plants and literally hundreds, as I understand, if not thousands, of protests of various kinds over the years. And so this is one of those technologies that has a climate impact and has other impacts, including basically cleaning the air and improving people's lives in that respect. One of the many extraordinary benefits of solar, maybe the most important other than the obvious one of dealing with climate, is the fact that you've got a situation where it's almost totally decentralized. The entire oil complex industry is in the hands of a couple dozen giant companies, either nationally owned or privately owned, that control what we do and how we burn our fuels and so forth. And solar literally can be in the backyard, the sort of the backyard revolution. I want to sort of open up the conversation with a few just almost random comments about or examples about some of the innovative approaches that solar is starting to take, in addition to Peter's discussion about solar panels now being white. In China, here we go. As you said, Paul, so much is happening in China. There is a project well underway, as I understand it, to produce over and place over 2,300 solar platforms 5 miles out to sea that can power 2.5 million homes right there. In Germany, the home, as it turns out, of what's often called balcony solar or plug-in solar, where just in a very few years, people go to their local Home Depot or IKEA or whatever the equivalent is and buy these panels. And because of regulatory reforms, they can almost literally plug them in the wall and lay them in the backyard or on their balcony. And there's something like 5 million of them right now in Germany. In parts of Europe, solar panels are so cheap that they're used as fencing. In France, there's a new law that requires that every large parking lot have solar canopies over it, so it doesn't just sit there with asphalt burning up in the sun. And I could go on, and I will as we continue this conversation. But I want to turn it back to Peter, if you'd like to reflect on anything that I said or that Paul said, or bring up any other dimensions, because this is a huge and important topic.
Of course, the biggest single threat to the increase, the acceleration of solar power is the United States Trump Republican administration. And they are indeed having an effect, and not only in the United States, they're arm twisting with their tariffs to Europe and India, and to discourage them from continuing increasing their renewable and specifically solar development. In the States, this so-called government has just passed another regulation on wind and solar, where things have to be approved by one of these idiots, which is in the current administration. But the good news, nevertheless, that I read today is that the United States solar industry registered its third best overall quarter on record, just gone. And so, what I want to do, first of all, is to congratulate all those people decades ago who were keen enthusiasts at what Paul was describing, the development on a home basis of renewable energy. If it wasn't for those people, we wouldn't be anywhere. So I want to greatly thank them. Also, I want to give a thanks to all the public, because the public acceptance of solar and renewable energy, of course, is another thing that's skyrocketing all around the world. I just want to give a quick mention to a really huge, important report that's just come out. That's called GEO7, that's UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook 7. This one was a good one. The last one was pretty lame. This one sort of had a headline of Transform or Collapse. And they included the total transformation of energy production and supply. And they stated that the fossil fuels have to be phased out as fast as possible. They also said that, of course, that the criminal fossil fuel subsidies from governments, they have to be stopped. So that was very good. I was very pleased what I read about this report. It's the biggest scientific report on the sort of state of the planet, really. The other thing they mentioned was the transformation of our economy, right? Because we still have an economy which basically favors the destruction of the environment and the construction and maldevelopment of those technologies and services. So the big theme is transformation. It's not just less, it's transformation, everything.
Yeah, I think that's the right word, Peter. And the question is transformation urgently, at speed and at scale. It's interesting because many of our viewers may be familiar with the concept of the S curve, that new technologies often start out slow. Not every technology, of course, but the ones then accelerate to the point where the vertical line on the graph, is almost vertical until it sort of reaches a high level, like in the case of phones, of cell phones and smartphones, and then it levels off. And we're sort of at the beginning of the upward S. You could say that there's sort of this worldwide drama that people like Trump and others, oil companies that are trying to desperately stop this S curve from continuing, and against these natural trends of inexpensive, all the other benefits. And, over the next decade will determine, literally within the next 10 years, whether solar reaches the point where no one can stop it because it's so inexpensive and there's so many benefits, or whether it can be truly thwarted as the efforts of some, unfortunately, are happening. Paul, if you put your policy-making hat on and you got elected to be the solar czar of Canada or of Ottawa or of Ontario or any place you'd like to be, what might you be recommending to your legislature or telling your bureaucrats to do to accelerate the adoption of solar energy?
We're focusing on solar, but of course, there's wind, there's battery technologies. You need batteries. The sun's not shining during the night. If you're generating all the power during the day, you need short-term battery storage to cover the nights. I would say embrace what China's doing and cut deals with China and get Chinese help and build factories in your own country producing solar and wind and batteries. Licensing, China gets their percentage cut, but the jobs are all in your own country, and you can retool the whole car industry, for example, and all these power plants. I mean, we're also going with small modular reactors in Canada, But, we could do far more in growing solar in this country. And there's too many politicians that aren't working in the interests of people. They're working in their own interests. We've been focusing on photovoltaics, right? The panels, but there is something called concentrated solar power. I just wanted to mention it's the idea of having a whole circular array of mirrors, all angled different amounts to focus the sun's rays onto a vessel at the top of a tower. You cause chemical transformation and you generate huge amounts of electricity. It's thermoelectric as opposed to the photovoltaic effect. And speaking of Einstein's discovery, his discovery of the photoelectric effect came towards the end of his career. They hadn't given him a Nobel Prize. So many people in the field in physics, they think this was like the booby prize for Einstein. He didn't get a Nobel Prize for quantum mechanics, for strong forces, weak forces, all of his physics of particles. He did so much work in all different fields of physics and no Nobel Prize. He pushed every field forward. So he did this photoelectric effect, and they said, okay, this is perfect. We'll give him the Nobel for this. And it turns out that's probably the single most important thing he did if the world is going to be generating our power one day completely from this sort of thing combined with other renewables. The offshore generation of solar is actually quite interesting and makes perfect sense because it's generally a bit cooler over the ocean. The reason why heat reduces efficiency is because it jiggles the particles around in the material and then they interfere with the processes that are generating the power. So if you have cooling with seawater and they're offshore, we can't fail to mention the incredible advances in the cables that carry the power from one region to another. Generally, solar is distributed. You don't need cross-country cables, power lines going many, many kilometers or miles because you're generating the power locally. But for the offshore rigs, for example, the solar power generated is DC, direct current. So you just have high voltage DC power lines, which we've made huge advances in those. The losses from these power lines is much, much lower. Look at a power line, it's mostly alternating current, the sine wave, but DC, you can get much lower losses. So all of these technologies are working in synergy, basically. If your country is run by STEM people, scientists, technologists, engineering, and mathematicians, and if you really treat education of people, there's no greater priority in China than education of people in all different fields, then there you go. You're going to get breakthroughs coming from them in this field, but also in many other fields as well. So it's just kind of a race, right? Can we actually, make a big impact to turn the emissions curve? Because it all comes down to that. And we haven't been able to turn it, but we're making dents in it, I guess, from clean energy.
Thank you, Paul. I think it's important as we wrap this program up, and thanks to Paul and Peter, to put I don't know if it's a sobering note or just a realistic note, which is in terms of the overall use of primary energy in the world. As I understand it, solar has increased in the last 20 years from 0% to 2%. And in terms of electricity, which is just one sector of it, because obviously most cars and industries are not powered by electricity, but by fossil fuels, it has gone from 0 to 7%. So we're going to have to get a whole lot faster, a whole lot quicker. So all the promising signs are there, and we've only scratched the surface today with the different technologies and processes and possibilities. And I would ask our viewers in your own lives to think about how you can adopt solar in your homes and your vehicles in the way you work, while recognizing that the best form of energy is your own personal energy to reduce the amount of energy you use, to walk more, to ride your bike, and all that. Because if all we're doing is replacing over 1 billion vehicles on the road that are internal combustion engines with electric, we've made some progress, but not nearly enough. So that's a subject of another day. The climate news I've noticed in the past week or so has been kind of yin and yang. So I'm going to give you pretty much one story that and I think most of you will think is positive, and then one is one that's not so positive. So let me start off with one from my country in the United States, where our Environmental Protection Agency, without announcement, as far as I could tell, decided to remove most, if not all, the references to climate change from its website. I'm sure most of you will feel much better now knowing that there won't be any more climate crisis because the US government has issued an edict making it so. On a positive note, and with total irony, the European Union at the same time, literally within the same day or two, agreed upon an amazing climate target of a reduction in greenhouse gases by 90% by 2040 in just 15 years or so. Could there be any more compelling contrast between what's happening on the two sides of the Atlantic? Back to the not so positive side, Exxon announced that we'll spend one-third less on low carbon initiatives coming up. Now, I'm not sure what low carbon initiatives, if any, they were spending their money on to begin with, but whatever it is, they're cutting back. But on the other hand, China has announced that they are spending $80 billion on clean tech, not in their own country, they're spending much more than that there, overseas to support other governments doing clean tech. Back to Brazil again on the other side, just days after COP30 ended, Brazil has apparently weakened safeguards to protect the Amazon. That one really blows my mind. And similarly to what we've discussed a bit in our previous few minutes or so about solar, the headline was that tactics to drop coal in Asia are weakening as energy demand booms. So apparently, as much as governments would prefer in many cases to do solar, the demand for energy is so great that unfortunately coal is back in the picture in some Asian countries. And lastly, we're going all around the world today. And in Africa, there was a study that just came out a few days ago that said that African forests have now switched from being a carbon sink, that is, they're pulling down more carbon than they release into the atmosphere for the whole continent. And now they're unfortunately a carbon source, meaning basically there's more greenhouse gases coming from the forest into the atmosphere, making the world hotter than there is reducing it by pulling down greenhouse gases. Before we sign off, I also want to mention a book that I recently read called Here Comes the Sun. Many of you may be familiar with that term from a famous musician, but whether you are or not, it's been written by Bill McKibben, and it's really a wonderful book that tells the story of solar and how critical it is for our goals to achieve the kind of climate outcomes that are necessary. So I would highly recommend it to our viewers. Again, thanks to Peter and Paul. Let me ask those of you who are watching to like this program, to subscribe to our channel, to go to our website, theclimateemergencyforum.org. We would encourage and ask you to donate if you have the opportunity to do so. And I want to take this time to thank, we've had a very generous donor, and we appreciate very much the contribution made, and we hope that others will join so that we can continue to provide you with what we believe is some of the best and most important programming on the climate emergency. And so with that, we will see you next week. Thanks as always.